By 2030, we will have 70% of our electricity coming from renewables. You will see solar parks as you drive through the countryside. You will see, I think, movement, would you believe, to hydrogen cars and not electric cars. So anybody who's bought a Tesla can probably need to think again.
The Architects of Business, with EY Entrepreneur of the Year, telling the inspirational stories behind Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs.
Hello and welcome to the Architects of Business, made in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year, where you'll hear the inspirational stories of some of Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs. I'm Sonya Lennon, broadcasting remotely from my home at this time. And on this week's show, I chat with John Mullins, the Executive Chairman of Amarenco Solar, an Irish energy company who believe that sustainable sun energy can curb climate change. They're harvesting all around the world and in Cork. If you haven't already done so, click subscribe to get brand new shows directly into your feed. You are very welcome to the Architects of Business, John Mullins, Executive Chairman of Amarenco Solar, a company that the general public might not be hugely familiar with, but a huge amount going on in the background. And John, in a way, you have reshaped the understanding of solar in Ireland from a very good position within the energy sector. I guess looking back at your story, it maybe started in a very, very different place. You're a Cork man, loud and proud, and your beginnings wouldn't necessarily have pointed to this position.
No, probably not. My mother grew up on the street where we have our headquarters, would you believe? And
that's
so
amazing.
There's a bit of nostalgia attached to that. My father was a painter decorator in Cork Corporation, worked with the council, and my mother was a part-time cleaner and used to clean the offices in AIB 66 South Mall, which is one of the great edifices of Cork City. And we were in a 2 up, 2 down in 4th Street. I was born in just south inner city, and we were waiting for a council house until I think 1976, and then we moved to the north side of the city into a brand new estate at the time, which is Knocknaheeny at the very top of the north side. And I went to the North Monastery. I think when I moved from Sullivan's Quay to North Monastery, I think the brothers up there thought I had some reading deficiency, so I was put on special reading duties in 2nd class, and then I gradually improved. I suppose that the education was good. The brothers were quite strict, but in my view, quite fair, and had a good education. And I did everything sport in the North Mon: athletics, basketball, hurling, football. Just loved everything like that. And as my mother said, it kept me off the street. So I was the first member of my family on both sides to go to university.
And so the leaning towards the sciences, when did that emerge?
Maths I was strong in maths going through primary and secondary school. And then, of course, then you got exposed to science in junior cert or inter cert as it was. And then I chose physics and chemistry. So quite clearly, my senior cycle was definitely orientated towards the sciences because I had a bent in that regard, and I was doing quite well. So I would say, I have this experience out with my own kids. Like, they're now in college, but more recently they would have gone through that cycle themselves. And it is very difficult for kids today and kids back then to understand what the hell am I going to do when I grow up. I suppose at the time there was kind of a points race, as there is today, to get into the top level courses. Because of a scientific bent, I had no interest in medicine or dentistry because I hate blood. So I then went for electrical engineering, and that's how I ended up in UCC in 85.
So I'm sure you thrived in that environment with your learning and your drive to improve. What happened straight afterwards?
And I suppose in terms of when I left college, I mean, I enjoyed myself in college, Sonia. Anybody who knows me knows that I'd be a
I'm getting a
individual.
sense of that, John. I'm getting a sense of it.
So I used to debate with people like Brendan O'Connor and people like that in college.
Brilliant.
And I was in a rock band and all of those things that you had to do. But then try and keep it.
I think there's another podcast in here somewhere.
No, there's not. What I'd say is that I enjoyed my time in university, and I suppose in '89 it was a terrible time, Sonia. You might remember. I mean, it was not a great time. It was ahead of Jack Charlton's 1990. There weren't that many jobs, and it was highly competitive to get a job at the time. And I was fortunate that I got an offer of a position by ESB. And I ended up going to Dublin at 21, living in Sandymount in an interesting rental, and started work for ESB back then. And within about a year, I was keeping the lights on by night in the National Grid Control Centre. Which was a fabulous experience. Because
your career is kind of defined by this prescience, this sort of almost predictive ability. Where did that come from, and what drove you to that particular area?
People in life, I think, Sonia, have intuition, but intuition is always informed as well. So your intuition gets improved with experience, and as a result, you see certain trends happening. And I think that's one of the things I would have learned through the EY program. A lot of entrepreneurs see things around corners that most people don't see, or they see solutions for problems that people haven't asked about yet. And I think that really is kind of core. So I suppose if you go through your journey in life and you're forever questioning or challenging either yourself or the context which you're in, you'll always actually start thinking about what's next. So, I mean, I've had plenty of examples of that, even prior to Amerenco, where you take bold moves essentially with a company and you push the envelope out effectively. So, but you see certain trends and you read certain signals. You don't always get it right, by the way, because, there's always going to be failure as well as success. But you try and use the wealth of your experience as you've built it up to really refine that intuition. But at the end of the day, I'm an engineer, Sonia. When I try and make a decision, I always actually look at what the debits and credits are or what the decision tree actually looks like. So I have a very logical approach. I try and put subjectivity into logic and then use that as the basis for moving forward.
What happened then? What was the duration of ESB and what happened next?
I mean, over a number of interactions, I was there for, I think, 8 years in total. I worked in operations. I worked in distribution. I worked in, as I say, the control center. I worked with then more laterally with ESB International and was involved in their biggest investment still, I think, overseas, which was I directed the project in Amorebieta outside of Bilbao, which was an 800 megawatt power plant. So I think at the time I was about, 32, 33 years of age at
Amazing.
that stage. So, yeah. So, but it was
a
fabulous
fantastic
experience.
a fantastic company as well, and stands very tall on its culture and its ethos and philosophy. So it must have been a great learning ground for you in terms of how a big company works.
Well, yeah. I mean, back then, I think we need to remember that when I joined ESB, it was a monopoly. Essentially, it didn't have competitors as you have today. It did all of the planning for energy in the country when it came to electricity. It wasn't involved in gas and other things as it is today. ESBI was just actually really coming together at that stage. And the view was, look, because there was going to be changes in the Irish market, ESB needs to decide about investments abroad. And in that regard, that's how I ended up being involved in the project in Spain. It was a fabulous experience, but I was surrounded by very brilliant engineers and very brilliant accountants and lawyers. And it's a company I have the highest respect for, even though later in my career, I had to take them on in combat with respect to the big switch and Bord Gais and all of that. But hopefully
so
there's a healthy respect there.
Well, let's move on to that, because you've done really well in ESB. You've brokered major deals. You've found yourself in a position of high power, and then you left.
Yeah, I moved. I moved to NTR. I suppose Jim Barry, who now heads up alternative investments for BlackRock. I knew him from my university days. We met and said, look, would I be interested in going across? Because they had just taken 51% of electricity, if you remember that. Eddie O'Connor had founded that. And I went in to NTR to really assist in terms of understanding where that business was going to go. And that business grew very rapidly. And I remember the first movements by electricity into Scotland and then into the United States. And of course, that business was sold for 1.8 billion enterprise value. And as we speak, Eddie's going through, excuse me, a similar exercise with his second company, Mainstream. But you were surrounded by people who were entrepreneurs and corporate entrepreneurs. And during that journey, excuse me, during that journey, we ended up going to the United States and setting up an ethanol business with Richard Branson's people in Nebraska, Indiana, and Tennessee. In fact, it was a great opening in northwestern Tennessee of our ethanol plant, which was 100 million gallons of ethanol. Remember, this is alcohol, right? And it was in a dry county. So if you wanted a drink, you had to go all the way down to Memphis to have one, right? So 3 hours away. But we were producing 100 million gallons of ethanol, which, by the way, was being splashed into gasoline in the United States. So we were converting corn to ethanol and then creating distillers' grains that went off to Texas steers to produce the beef in the United States. So, but that business now was then combined with another business, and it's now on the NASDAQ. So the origins of a NASDAQ company actually originated through that experience. But I wasn't there for the listing because I got a phone call one day getting off a jet in Pittsburgh. Would I be interested in heading up Bord Gais? I said to myself, look, I'm 39 years of age. Jim Barry's not going anywhere. So I decided, look, I'd go for the interview. And I gave them a certain vision about the fact that they needed to be a dual fuel utility, that they needed to get into electricity. They had a big gas background, and that was about it. They were about to build a power plant in Whitegate in Cork. And I had that renewable experience as well. So that vision was there from the start.
Yeah, you thought even before.
Yeah. I mean, I gave the presentation at the interview. I said, this is what I'd like to do. And clearly people took it on board. And I implemented that program over the 5 years. And I remember going into Padraig McManus, who was the ESB CEO at the time. I knew him, of course, I hadn't worked in ESB. And I said, look, I have to apologize, Padraig, that, we have this power plant and I'm going to have to enter the residential market. I hope you don't mind. Don't worry about that, he said. So that was fine until we took 500,000 customers off ESB.
Ooh. Well, at least you were polite about it, John.
I know. I by the way, I happened to be Padraig recently, and we're nothing but polite with each other. But in a way, it did ESB a favor because it accelerated the liberalization of the market, which really the regulator had been pushing. And at the time, the Lucy Kennedy ads had worked quite well. We were very happy with the success,
to say the least. I think it's extraordinary when you think about what you achieved from getting that phone call in Pittsburgh to 5 years later. That transformation of that company is pretty extraordinary. And I suppose it could only come to you from your wealth of experience that there was something else out there. When did that moment come for you?
Well, I suppose I had worked in London with PwC, and I had consulted with companies that were ahead in the cycle in Europe, where they had liberalized and they had opened up their market well ahead of the Irish market. So I knew exactly what the trends were, what the tricks of the trade had been effectively in the UK. And in essence, I was just basically taking all of that learning and saying, right, This is what was successful in the United Kingdom, particularly in England and Wales. A dual fuel offering is exactly what is needed here. In addition to that, the trend to decarbonisation is really happening. And I remember raising a bond for Bord Gais in 2009. Now, this is in the middle of a crisis. We raised a 500 million euro bond after a roadshow right across Europe, which was exhausting. And we got some reaction from some countries, right, and some investor communities, which was not good, because they did not view Ireland as a good place, particularly after the crash. But we went out on the basis that we were going to spend 1/3 of the money raised on gas pipelines and 2/3 of the money on renewable electricity. And we got the bond away, and the bond came in cheaper than what the government was raising debt over a 5-year period.
Wow.
And primarily because we were seen as a more solid bet than the sovereign at that time. And remember, the Troika were just about to join us in Marine Street at that time.
That's extraordinary. So with Amerenco then, when did that begin its journey?
It began when I became unemployed on the 1st of January 2013.
Fair enough.
I was just after my family just left. I remember the Ormond Hotel in Kilkenny, and I was on my way back to hand in my laptop, hand in my car. The next thing I had to do was to go up to the airport, hire a car until I got myself a new one. I had no office. I had no PAs anymore. I had none of the...
Sorry, John, this was on the back of the privatisation of the company?
No, this was on the back of leaving Bord Gais. I was offered a 2-year extension. I didn't go for it. I decided I was going to go and try something for myself.
So self-inflicted unemployment.
Self-inflicted unemployment, a personal choice. And you had to have the confidence that you were going to go and do something. So I had some personal reserves and decided that I'd go and look into what was essentially an emerging opportunity for me, which was the idea that solar was going to happen. It was accelerating its prevalence in international energy markets because the price of solar panels was coming down, as were inverters and all of the kit attached to this. So therefore, it's becoming a lot cheaper. And I hooked up with a number of former colleagues, and we created a company basically. And then I went about raising money, raised the first 500,000, tried to raise 150 million with a very prominent bank in London, did a roadshow there, failed miserably. But we had one project, and there's a picture of the project, not the one you see behind me, but further up the boardroom. And I had to raise 5.2 million euros of retail money to make it happen. So I had to make something like 300 cold calls to pension brokers across the country to get this project over the line. And we kept on telling the German company that the money's on its way, the money's on its way. But we finally got there and closed that. And then fortunately, we got the support of Ian Quinn, an entrepreneur himself out of Cregana, and he invested in a couple of assets which we pulled together for him. And then we also then went out and raised more retail money, but more formally through people like Harvest Financial Services and Cantor Fitzgerald, who we now have a very good relationship with. And by the time we knew it, we had 5 plants in France. We didn't have a fund. They came from different sources. It was a lot of knocking on doors to raise the money for each of these. But we had the capability to understand the engineering in the team and also understand the corporate finance. There was about 5 of us at the outset. We now have over 140 people working for us worldwide. And
amazing.
I think we have done...
Can I ask you, John, 24 deals. Now, 24 deals in terms of financing.
Yeah, 24 projects, so this is portfolios. Yeah. financing.
So it's interesting because the model of this business is extremely hungry. So you need to keep raising the funds to release the potential in the company, and yet it is unbelievably revenue generating.
Well, the beauty of renewable projects generally, whether it's wind or solar projects, is that, for every €1 that you earn, you'll probably get about 82 cents EBITDA.
That's quite a margin.
Yeah. So the operating costs of renewable assets are actually quite low. But that's why we leverage them, and we get banks to come in to take at least 70% generally of the capital cost of these assets. And then we would add 30%. And in that regard, we've also added things like junior debt and crowdfunding as part of the mix. So that
I love this piece. Now, you have had a sort of a gravitational pull towards France, I think, in terms of funding.
Yes, indeed.
And talk to me about
projects.
And also projects.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this crowdfunding piece, because the mechanism of it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's and I really wouldn't. And I've been in touch with people like David McRedmond, who I know quite well from Post, about looking at this. And I've spoken to AIB about this, amongst others. There was a group that we knew in Bordeaux called LUMO, LUMO. It was taken over by SocGen, by the way, Société Générale. And they started this process of putting a picture of a project up on the portal and inviting people basically to put €100 or €1,000. The average investment in these projects on a crowdfunding basis is about €1,200. So people were putting savings essentially in there, but they were guaranteed 4.5% per annum. Now, show me a deposit account that will give you 4.5%. And you get paid ahead of the developer, behind the senior debt, but ahead of the promoter of the project. So in essence, unless something catastrophic happens to a project, you're assured that your money is going to be there and you'll get repaid.
And it's underpinned then by a financial institution who are putting up the capital. It's enabled by a financial institution that have the professional capability to look at the nature of the asset and say, this is an asset for you. This is an asset I think you should invest in. And they get 4 to 5% for about 4 years. And then we would go about refinancing that asset once the asset is up and running and has proved itself, etc. But the idea here is that you could put a number of these renewable projects up on a portal, raise money, just a bit like what linked finance or grid finance do, Sonya, in the context of other sectors. And you're dealing with an asset that is government backed from the fact that the revenue, once the sun shines, you get paid by the government, right? And you know what the operating cost base is, and you know there's enough cash in the business to pay out the coupon every year and to refinance you after 4 years. We've so much to get through, and we've so little time left. In one quick answer, how long do you think it would be, hypothetically, before you could get an organisation or an arrangement like that up in Ireland?
I think you could get this up and running within 6 months.
That's why you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I don't see a reason why. I mean, look, the reality is, Sonya, you and I cannot make money out of a bank deposit. Our pensions now are actually going to have negative interest rates against us going forward. You know, if you want to have a pension pot in the future, you're going to have to take a wee bit of risk, right? And by investing in assets like this, it makes real sense because it supports the decarbonization of our community. But it also actually means that you have more money in your pocket when it comes to retirement, or when you want to actually, liquidate that particular deposit. And
you're part of saving the planet, which is all there you good. Go. Talk to me about Cobh, because I think for the average listener or viewer, the decrease in costs in solar power has been quite extraordinary.
Yes, it has, and module prices have come down by 80% in the last 5 years. It's a significant reduction, primarily motivated by the fact that 9 of the 10 top module manufacturers are Chinese. They have a very serious decarbonization program in China, and they have some of the largest solar farms in the world. They are increasing that production capacity as we go forward. The expectation is that we will have 13 million megawatts of solar in the world by 2050. Now, by the way, all of Ireland is 10,000 megawatts of all power, just to put that in context. So the scale of solar in terms of its deployment between 2020 and 2050 is enormous. And
am I right in thinking the tariffs? Yeah, the tariffs have only just been released now for Ireland, is that right?
Yeah, so we just put a competition in, and you talked about Cobh. Cobh is now qualified. We won 40 megawatts through 8 projects this week. We'll be building next year in Ireland for the first time, which we're delighted to say is a big plus for us. I was one of the first to go out and meet the farmers 5 years ago, and they've stayed with me, and I'm thankful for that. But we have a number of other projects on the way. In the recent auction, the average price of solar was 73 euros a megawatt hour. That's 7 cents a unit in bill terms. Wind and solar together, the average price was 74.5. So actually, solar is now, would you believe, becoming competitive with wind in an Irish context, which we were only a one-trick pony in this country with respect to renewable energy for 25 years, which was all onshore wind. We now actually have this mix of onshore wind and solar. And I think you'll see that solar will dominate the new builds in renewable energy in Ireland until such time as offshore wind gets moving, which is probably going to be 2025 by the time you see the first major projects built. But it's a very good time for solar at this stage.
So when you see a publication of stats around, this being the dullest July that we've had, is that a problem for you?
Well, over the longer term, solar radiation doesn't change that much, right? So you may have plus or minus 5%. So if I take the assets in France, we've assets all over France, in Guadeloupe, and we have them in Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean. We have them in Corsica. We would say plus or minus 5% over the year. You could have a fantastic January, February, and March. We had an excellent April, from memory. During lockdown, thankfully kept us all safe.
Certainly did.
And we've had a very poor July, no doubt about that. But you do get months that make up for that.
Level out.
Absolutely. But we're building projects now in Spain that don't need a tariff. We're building projects in Oman that don't need a tariff. In Thailand that don't need a tariff. I mean, we're now in markets that don't need subsidy. They are the cheapest form of new electricity in those markets. And the reason why is that the irradiation levels are between 1,500 and 2,000 hours a year. In Cloyne or in Cobh, it's about 1,000 hours. So you can understand that there's quite a differential. In France, in the south of France, around 1,500 to 1,600 hours a year of sunshine at full load. So we know exactly how tariffs are going to be structured going forward. But for solar to be at 72 euros a megawatt hour on average in Ireland is a massive change from when we started looking at this. I would say that we were looking at tariffs of 130.
So all of a sudden you're in your own future. And yes. I mean, I think the story is phenomenal, what you've done and every sort of stepping stone that you've taken to this point. You are on this podcast because you are an EY Entrepreneur of the Year alumnus. What has that meant to you? What has been the value of that to you and the importance of it?
Well, I was at a number of the EY functions many years ago, actually, when I was CEO of Bord Gais. I was invited a number of times to attend. And I always found the stories phenomenal, right? And then, of course, when I was president of the Cork Chamber of Commerce for 2 years, and I was involved heavily in the chamber, and I would have got to know a lot of entrepreneurs in the Cork region over that period. And they're inspiring people. And you kind of say to yourself, and I say this to myself, Sonya, life is not a dress rehearsal. That's why I decided not to take the contract in 2012. That's why I decided to go off and do something and have the strength of my own convictions to go about and do something. I'm surrounded in the alumni by people who have done crazy things in the eyes of their friends and family, but they have been extremely successful. They know what failure is about, and they know how to learn. They know how to actually, when you meet them, swap ideas, have a contact sheet, help each other out. And certainly you could see that in the middle of lockdown, how people were trying to help each other out. What they're trying to do,
co-create, isn't there a sort of a creative energy around it?
It's phenomenal. And in addition to that, Sonya, you look at the sort of insurance issues that businesses have in Ireland. The alumni is very serious about dealing with public liability insurance issues, essentially, because a lot of the alumni have locations where the public come in and out. And as a result, they're not happy with business insurance. And, they are lobbying very hard to change the rules and the law with respect to fairness with businesses who suffer excessive claims or fraudulent claims. And these are the type of topics that are coming up in terms of discussions. And we have our own group, our WhatsApp group, which is excellent. And you get to hear about people's successes. And it drives, if you're part of that type of club, it's a great club to be part of. But it was great, actually, going back to the start of this. It was great for my parents at 75 years of age to go to City West last year to attend. And I've never seen my father in a tux, but he was looking quite dapper on the evening, I can tell you.
I'd say he was.
And my brothers were there, my 4 younger brothers and my family. And it was a fantastic experience. And I suppose, it's the kind of a culmination, let's say, in terms of your travel through the career. There's probably only one thing left that I'd like to do, which is try and get Amerenco into a position with my colleagues where we would be an IPO candidate and see that.
Well, I'm looking at your predictions. I'm looking at your predictions for the future of energy provision in Ireland. And,
yes.
And I'm going to let you make the statement of what you believe it is by 2030.
By 2030, we will have 70% of our electricity coming from renewables. You will see solar parks as you drive through the countryside. Hopefully not too many, because we're supposed to visually block them from people on the roads. But you will see them. You will see, I think, movement, would you believe, to hydrogen cars and not electric cars. So anybody who's bought a Tesla, you probably need to think again, because by 2030, I do believe that liquid hydrogen, green hydrogen, is going to overtake it, because there are issues, in my view, around lithium ion going forward. Whereas hydrogen is just created from water and electrolysis. It's a very simple process. So my sense is that you can see hydrogen replacing electric vehicles going forward.
And I think there's a lot of discussion in the ether about that, to excuse the pun. John Mullins, Chief Executive Chairman of Amarenco Solar. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I have no doubt that you are the future right now of renewable energy. And as you continue to dominate the space, congratulations and best of luck.
Thank you, Sonya. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening and watching Architects of Business, made in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year. Thanks to the team here at JOE, and of course to our entrepreneur today, John Mullins. If you haven't already done so, click subscribe to get brand new shows directly into your feed.